There comes a point in every man's life when he must stop reacting and start remembering who he is. When you've given, explained, waited, and she still doesn't see your value, your silence becomes your strongest language. Because when presence is taken for granted, absence becomes unforgettable. You see, attention is not just something you give freely without consequence. It's a currency. A man's attention, when given without discernment, loses all of its power. When a woman knows that you are constantly available, constantly present, constantly validating her with your energy, your time, your messages, and your emotional investment, she does not see it as generosity. She sees it as standard. It becomes expected, and anything expected becomes unappreciated. A man who is always there becomes invisible, and in today's world, where women are constantly flooded with likes, messages, DMs, compliments, and emotional stimulation from countless men online and offline, your presence, no matter how genuine, is thrown into the same category as the noise. When you keep giving your attention freely, you are unknowingly devaluing it. It becomes cheap in her eyes. She begins to subconsciously associate you with weakness, not because you are weak, but because your energy is always on tap. Readily available, predictable, and the human mind doesn't crave what's predictable. It craves what's scarce. Just like anything else in life, the less something is available, the more value we place on it. Scarcity is the engine of desire. When your attention is rare, deliberate, and controlled, it triggers her curiosity. It breaks her pattern of emotional overstimulation. It forces her to stop and wonder, why isn't he texting me? Why did he go quiet? Why does he no longer see me as a priority? That pause, that break in the cycle, that is where the haunting begins. Now imagine the contrast. You were always there. You replied within minutes. You were checking in. You were making plans. You were showing care, support, interest, and consistency. And she didn't respond with the same energy. She took longer to reply. She canceled plans. She became vague, cold, or indifferent. And still you showed up. You kept giving, hoping that if you just gave a little more, she would finally recognize your worth. But she didn't. Why? Because your attention no longer meant anything to her. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't rare. But the moment you disappear, the moment you stop replying, stop chasing, stop explaining, stop giving her your emotional presence, the silence hits harder than any message. You've shifted the dynamic. You've taken something she thought was guaranteed and made it unavailable. You've made her feel the absence of your energy, and that absence is what creates value. Think about it. Have you ever truly appreciated air until you were gasping for it? Have you ever valued clean water until you were thirsty? The same applies to your attention. When it's there all the time, it blends into the background, but when it's gone, when the stream goes dry, it becomes a drought she can't ignore. And in that emotional drought, she will begin to reflect. She'll start going back through your old messages. She'll rewatch the stories you posted. She'll analyze why you didn't respond. She'll go from indifference to curiosity, from curiosity to concern, and from concern to obsession. And all of that began with one decision. You stopped giving your attention freely. You created emotional scarcity. You made your energy rare. And in that rarity, you became valuable, not just in her eyes, but in your own. Because now your attention is something to be earned, not expected, something to be respected, not dismissed, something that speaks even louder in its absence than it ever did in your words. When you're always available, always responding, always present, She never has to stop and truly reflect on anything. Your constant presence gives her emotional comfort, even if she doesn't consciously value it. It's like having music playing in the background all the time. You stop noticing the lyrics. You stop appreciating the rhythm. It becomes white noise. But the moment that music is shut off, there's a strange silence. Suddenly, the absence becomes louder than the presence ever was. That's what emotional scarcity does. It stops the music. It forces her to sit with silence. It forces her to feel the absence of something she had become numb to. A woman cannot begin to process her own behavior, her own decisions, her own role in the disconnection as long as she knows you're still emotionally anchored to her. If she knows she can act cold, disrespectful, or distant, and you'll still be there texting, calling, asking to talk, sending long paragraphs trying to make her understand, then she has no reason to do any inner work. No need to look inward. But when you go silent, when you stop participating in the emotional game, something shifts. The mirror turns. Instead of you trying to explain your worth, now she's left to sit alone with her own reflection. And that's not a comfortable place for many people, especially for someone who has always felt in control of the emotional narrative. That's when the haunting begins, not through revenge, not through games, but through stillness. Because now she begins to question everything. The conversations that once annoyed her are suddenly missed. The good morning texts she rolled her eyes at are now nowhere to be found. The calls she ignored are gone. Her phone becomes quiet, but her mind becomes loud. That's what silence does. It amplifies thoughts. It creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, all the things she suppressed, ignored, or dismissed begin to resurface. Now she replays everything. The way you looked at her when she spoke, the way you laughed at her jokes, the way you remembered small details about her. She starts scanning through old messages, checking your social media, watching your stories just to feel a tiny spark of the connection that used to be consistent. That's when the memories start to replay like scenes in a movie she didn't realize she'd miss. She scrolls back through your photos, your messages, even your voice notes. She's looking for something, but she doesn't even know what. She's trying to find a reason. She's trying to confirm that maybe you're still there, still emotionally lingering, still wondering. But the truth is, you're not. You're gone, not physically maybe, but emotionally you've detached, and that detachment echoes. When emotional scarcity sets in, it's not about hurting her, it's about confronting her with a truth she refused to face, that your presence was not guaranteed, that your love was not disposable, that your time and energy were never infinite. It was all a gift, one she took for granted, and now that gift is no longer being offered. It's gone, and in its place is silence. A silence she didn't expect, a silence she didn't prepare for, a silence that forces her to finally ask, "What did I do?" The more emotionally attuned a man is, the more devastating his silence becomes. Not because he's trying to manipulate, but because the silence itself becomes the lesson. When you stop chasing, when you stop talking, when you stop trying to be understood, she begins to feel the emptiness that she once thought you needed her to fill. But now, that emptiness is hers to sit with. That absence is hers to wrestle with. That reflection, no matter how distorted it once was, begins to clear. That's why emotional scarcity isn't just a tactic. It's a turning point. It's when the emotional weight shifts, when the tables turn, when the noise fades, and the silence speaks louder than anything you could ever say. Control is a subtle drug, and many women, especially in today's attention-driven culture, have become addicted to the emotional control they unconsciously exert over men. It's not always malicious. It's often just a byproduct of how validation operates in modern dynamics. When a woman realizes that she can make you angry, make you chase, make you explain yourself, or even just make you respond with emotional urgency, she begins to form a narrative where she is at the center of power. This dynamic doesn't require her to love you or even respect you. It only requires that you react, because reaction equals attachment, and attachment in her mind equals control. So when she tests you, pulling away, becoming vague, being dismissive or emotionally distant, and you respond by over-explaining yourself, demanding clarity, or desperately seeking answers, you're unintentionally feeding her the reassurance that she still holds the strings. She might not even realize she's doing it, but she can feel it. He still cares. He still wants me. I can still stir his emotions. That's power, and power, when unchecked, is rarely respected. But the moment you go silent, when you do not flinch, do not beg, do not plead, do not react, something in her reality breaks. It's a fracture in the pattern. She expects the usual, you to question her, pursue her, try to fix it, but you don't. You disappear, you withdraw emotionally, you stop playing her game, and in that moment she loses control, not just of you, but of the narrative she was comfortable with. That's what truly begins to haunt her, not just that you're gone, but that she no longer knows where she stands. She might check her phone repeatedly, not because she wants to talk, but because she's trying to confirm that the leash is still attached. And when it's not, when the notifications stop, when your name no longer appears, when your stories stop watching hers, that silence doesn't just speak, it screams. It tells her she no longer has emotional leverage. She no longer has the ability to provoke a reaction. You've reclaimed the power, and for many women who have built their sense of self on emotional influence over others, this loss of power is jarring. What makes this even more haunting is that your silence is not explained. You didn't give her closure, you didn't tell her off, you didn't scream or blame, you just disappeared. And because there's no clear ending, her mind doesn't get to close the chapter. You've left her stuck in limbo. She doesn't know if you've moved on, if you're angry, if you're seeing someone else, or if you simply stopped caring. That uncertainty becomes mental poison. The female brain, especially when faced with emotional ambiguity, begins to spiral. Questions multiply. Why did he go silent? Did I go too far? Why didn't he fight for me? Is he happier without me? But the most haunting question of all is, was I never in control to begin with? Because your silence forces her to confront something she had avoided, that the control she thought she had was always conditional. It was an illusion built on your emotional investment. And once that investment is gone, once your attention is withdrawn and your presence disappears, that illusion collapses. She's left standing in a house of cards that you no longer support, and the fall is deafening. This shift in dynamic doesn't just bruise her ego, it disrupts her identity, especially if she has built it around being desired, chased, and emotionally pursued. Your silence becomes a mirror, not one that reflects her beauty or desirability, but one that reflects the reality of her actions. It makes her wonder how someone she thought she could control has now become completely inaccessible. Not physically perhaps, but emotionally, spiritually, energetically. And what she can't access, she can't influence. What she can't influence, she starts to obsess over. That's how your silence begins to haunt her, not through words, not through manipulation, but by stripping her of the one thing she never thought she'd lose, the control over your emotional state. Let's make something very clear. Ignoring her is not about playing games, manipulating her emotions, or trying to wound her ego out of bitterness. It's not a performance, it's not immaturity, it's not toxic. It's a response to being overlooked, disrespected, emotionally drained, and taken for granted. When you ignore her, when you pull back, when you finally go silent, it is not a weapon, it is a boundary. A boundary forged from self-respect, because at some point a man must ask himself, how much longer am I willing to explain my worth to someone who refuses to see it? A woman who truly values you will never put you in a position where you feel invisible. She won't push your emotional limits. She won't test your patience endlessly just to see if you'll still stay. But when she does, when she disrespects your time, your effort, your vulnerability, when she starts to treat your consistency like a burden instead of a blessing, then ignoring her is not revenge. It's a recalibration of your standards. It's your soul quietly saying enough. It's one of the hardest things for a man to do. To go silent, not out of rage, but out of realization. Because we're conditioned to fix things, to clarify, to make sure she knows what we meant. To keep trying, thinking that one more message, one more conversation, one more effort will finally unlock her understanding. But it never does, because understanding doesn't come from repetition. It comes from recognition. And if she hasn't recognized your value by now, more effort won't convince her. It will only drain you. You start to see that the more you try to explain why you're hurt, the more she uses it as proof that you're weak. The more you tell her how she made you feel, the more she rolls her eyes, accuses you of overreacting, or worse, calls you dramatic or insecure. And every time you explain, every time you express, every time you ask for clarity or accountability, you're just confirming to her that your emotions are available for her to manipulate, that she can toy with your heart, and you'll still show up. So you stop, not because you don't care anymore, but because you finally do about yourself. You stop reaching out. You stop defending yourself. You stop trying to be understood by someone who only listens when you're begging. That silence, that stillness, it's not avoidance, it's growth. It's a man stepping into emotional sovereignty. He's no longer chasing peace from someone who profits off his chaos. And that's the part that cuts deep for her. Because she never expected that. She expected you to rant, to cry, to send long, emotional paragraphs explaining how much you cared and how hurt you were. She expected the chase, the pleading, the desperate attempt to win her back. But when all she's met with is silence, she starts to realize she miscalculated. She thought you were weak because you expressed emotion, but now she sees that silence wasn't your last resort. It was your decision. A decision born not from anger, but from clarity. That clarity is terrifying to her, because now she has no idea where you stand. She doesn't know if you're done, if you've moved on, if you've lost interest, or if you've finally discovered your worth and realized she never truly matched it. And because she doesn't know, she starts to wonder, to question, to feel. That silence she once mistook for emotional immaturity now feels like power. It unsettles her. It shifts the ground beneath her. She begins to search for signs of you, on social media, in mutual circles, maybe even in the energy of other men who now pale in comparison. She begins to feel the coldness that your warmth used to protect her from. She begins to recognize that what she thought was just attention was actually emotional security, that the texts weren't clingy, they were consistent, that your need for communication wasn't too much. It was a sign of emotional availability she couldn't match. And now your absence is louder than anything you could have said. You're not ignoring her because you want her to suffer. You're not walking away to break her. You're doing it because you're finally done breaking yourself just to be seen. You're not playing cold to punish her. You're just choosing peace over pain, silence over struggle, distance over disrespect. What she does with that silence is up to her, but what you've done with it, that's what sets you free. Mystery is one of the most potent psychological forces in human attraction, and the absence of information can create more emotional turbulence than any confrontation ever could. You see, a man who becomes unpredictable, who detaches, who stops showing his cards, is infinitely more powerful than one who pours his emotions out hoping to be understood. When you were constantly available, constantly explaining, constantly present in her digital and emotional world, she knew what to expect. There was no curiosity, no suspense, no need to chase. But the moment you go silent, the moment you stop reaching out, stop commenting, stop reacting, a void is created. And into that void rushes her own insecurity, confusion, and need for emotional closure. That's the birth of obsession, not when she knows how you feel, but when she can no longer figure it out. And the irony is, it's not about you changing who you are. It's not about becoming cold or manipulative. It's about understanding a universal truth. What people can't access, they begin to desire. Especially women who are used to being emotionally pursued, who are accustomed to men proving their worth through action, attention, and validation. When you go silent, you become an unsolved puzzle, an emotional equation she can't balance. You were once easy to read, and now you've become unreadable. That unpredictability triggers her mind in a way few things can. She starts overanalyzing everything. That last message you sent, the way you said goodbye, the fact that you left her on read, or worse, didn't read it at all. She checks your story views, sees you online, notices you liking other content but not hers. And suddenly she feels it, the pull, the confusion, the tension between what was once predictable and what is now unknown. You've introduced mystery, and mystery, when paired with emotional scarcity, becomes a psychological itch that she cannot scratch. This is when she starts replaying the past, going through old texts, remembering your voice, the rhythm of your presence, the comfort of your consistency. But now all she's left with is silence. Your silence isn't just a lack of words, it's a lack of access. She can't feel your energy anymore. She can't sense your attention. And that unavailability breeds obsession, not because you're manipulating her, but because you've finally stopped making yourself easy to reach. And that's when something even deeper happens. She begins to compare. Not just compare you to other men, but compare how she felt when you were around to how she feels now that you're not. And what haunts her most is not the loss of conversation, but the loss of emotional security. Your attention may have felt like noise to her at the time, but in your absence, she realizes it was music. It had rhythm, it had meaning, it had presence. Now that it's gone, she can't get the melody out of her head. She might not reach out immediately. Pride and ego will hold her back. But inside, she's pacing, wondering, doubting. And with every day that passes without a message from you, her curiosity becomes concern, and that concern begins to quietly bloom into obsession. She starts to check if you've moved on. Is there someone else? Did he lose interest? Why isn't he doing what all the other guys do? Begging, apologizing, chasing. What she doesn't realize is that you've detached, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. You've realized that your peace matters more than proving your worth to someone who couldn't recognize it when it was right in front of her. And this new version of you, the quiet, mysterious, emotionally unavailable version, is now taking up more space in her mind than the overly available, emotionally expressive man ever did. Because in her world, where attention is abundant and validation is cheap, what's truly rare is a man who can detach. A man who doesn't need to explain himself. A man who doesn't need to be heard to feel validated. A man who can go ghost, not as a game but as a statement. A man who knows that mystery isn't created by silence alone, but by the strength it takes to remain silent while the other person waits for your response that never comes. And as that mystery deepens, so does her emotional unrest. She tries to act unbothered, posts stories to provoke a response, maybe even tries to make you jealous, but none of it works, because you're no longer available to play the game. You've left the arena, and that emotional emptiness, that absence of access, begins to feel like punishment. Not because you're punishing her, but because she's now being confronted by something she thought would never happen: indifference. That's the paradox. When you were emotionally open, you were invisible. Now that you're distant, you're unforgettable. Not because you did anything dramatic, but because the space you once filled with steady presence has now become a haunted room in her mind, full of echoes, what-ifs, and unanswered questions. One of the deepest truths a man must come to realize is this: the more you ignore what's not real, the more you create space for what is. When you detach from the woman who only loved the version of you that served her ego, you begin the process of returning home to yourself. See, emotional scarcity isn't just about punishing her for not valuing you. It's about healing yourself from the illusion that her validation ever defined your worth. It's about seeing clearly, for the first time, that what you were giving her, your time, your energy, your love, wasn't just something casual. It was sacred. But you handed it over to someone who didn't understand its weight. And now, through silence and absence, you reclaim it, because when you ignore a woman who never truly saw you, what you're really doing is cutting the energetic cord between your soul and her ego. You're no longer allowing your emotions to be the playground of her indecision. You're no longer placing your masculine peace on the altar of her fickle attention span. You're choosing solitude over chaos, silence over noise, peace over potential, and in doing so you become rare, not just to her but to yourself. You rediscover the parts of you that were once lost in the pursuit of her approval. The modern man is starving for real connection, but often settles for temporary attention disguised as intimacy. That's why so many stay in toxic loops, confusing attachment with love and confusion with chemistry. But when you walk away, truly walk away, you begin to see that most of what you were chasing wasn't love. It was the hope that if you gave enough, she would finally give back. But she didn't. She took more. And you bled silently while calling it passion, but not anymore. Not once you've gone silent. Not once you've tasted emotional scarcity from your own hand, not as a weapon but as a boundary. And something profound begins to happen. You start to see who you were becoming in that relationship, how much of your light you dimmed to keep her comfortable, how many times you held back your truth to avoid conflict, how often you gave when your soul was tired, hoping she'd eventually notice. But now, in your silence, in your withdrawal, that reflection becomes clear, and it doesn't lie. You start hearing your own voice again, feeling your own strength again. You stop being emotionally reactive, and you start being spiritually selective. And that's when your entire energy changes. You're no longer vibrating at the frequency of desperation or confusion. You're no longer addicted to her response. Whether she reaches out or not, Whether she moves on or not, you stop caring, not because you're cold, but because you've finally warmed your own heart. You've placed yourself back at the center. You've learned to give yourself what you were begging her for: validation, appreciation, attention, love. Women can feel this shift, even if you haven't said a word, even if you've gone completely ghost. She feels it in the way your energy no longer wraps around her like it used to. She feels the absence of the emotional pull you once had. And for the first time, she realizes that something real has left her life. Not just a man, not just attention, but a presence, a force, a certainty. You see, your love was never the problem. It was the placement. You gave king level energy to someone who treated it like common currency. But now the crown is back on your head, and that changes everything, because you're not out here trying to prove your high value. You've become it, not through ego, not through money, but through emotional discipline, through spiritual detachment, through walking away not to hurt her, but to stop hurting yourself. And here's the paradox. The more you ignore women who are not emotionally available, the more you attract the ones who are. The more you create space by being unavailable to what is fake, the more you welcome in what is real. Women who see your silence will feel its power. Some will be haunted by it. Others will be drawn to it. But you'll no longer be swayed. You're not accessible to chaos anymore. You've become the storm, and storms don't chase. They shift the atmosphere wherever they go. So understand this. Your silence is not emptiness, it's presence. It's not about playing games or seeking revenge. It's about reclaiming your power, rebuilding your identity, and restoring your peace. When you ignore her, not out of hate but out of healing, you shift the dynamic entirely. She may not understand it today. She may not admit it tomorrow. But the echo of your absence will linger far longer than the sound of your words ever did. Let her wonder, let her feel, let her face the mirror of your detachment. Because while she may forget a man who begged, explained, or chased, she will never forget the man who walked away silently and never looked back.